Hi, I'm Nora, and I have a lot of thoughts. I've been thinking about mass panic. In late September 2018, tens of thousands of concertgoers in New York City faced the unimaginable. Just after Cardi B finished her set at the Global Citizen Festival, the sound of something like shots rang out. And then panic.
The spotlights were turned on and many people started running.
Thousands and thousands of people dropped to the floor, hiding behind barricades, hiding in porta potties.
Can you send me like 2 ambulances, please? We have like 3 patients and a lot of people coming out of the park with injuries.
But in a matter of minutes, it was clear there had been no shots.
Nobody is trying to hurt anybody. You're all safe, okay?
At that point, it was almost too late. A police chief said trying to control the crowd was like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. In the end, the New York City Fire Department says at least 37 people were injured. Later, police would figure out that the sound was just people stepping on empty water bottles. But that was enough. It was almost exactly 1 year after the Las Vegas concert shooting. So, why did people react the way they did? Today, we're going to talk about trauma. We'll talk about what happens when that trauma is triggered and what you can do in these kinds of situations. But also, we're actually pretty strong as people, and that plays out even when we're stressed. Let's start with trauma. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, 60% of American men and 50% of women have experienced some kind of traumatic event in their lives. Research shows that trauma has long-lasting effects on people, like increased likelihood of depression or anxiety. Quick rabbit hole. That's all part of a widening field of research on the impacts of trauma known as traumatology. That research has actually changed the definition of trauma. In 1987, the American Psychiatric Association officially defined a traumatic event as a psychologically distressing event that is outside the range of normal experience. But as one researcher explained, that definition didn't work because scientists realized that traumatic events are not outside the normal range of experience. What's so traumatic is that they're usually part of our normal lives. Traumatology also tells us that trauma is not only individual. There's a kind of societal or community trauma known as macro-level trauma. Events that don't threaten your own life or safety and didn't even happen to you can still traumatize you. You're not crazy if you feel affected by a mass shooting or a terror attack, even one that happened hundreds of miles away. And that trauma impacts how you react in future situations. That brings us to trauma triggers. When there's a trigger, or something that brings up the ghost of past trauma, many people react in different ways. Brief rabbit hole here. Arguably the most prominent traumatology book is a 2001 work called The Body Bears the Burden. Its author, Robert Scaer, argued for the existence of a kind of body memory. His research showed that the residue of trauma is embodied, lives in the body, even for unconscious memories that you don't even remember. But your body does, and that can manifest later by, for example, an aversion to loud noises if you were previously in a shooting. When a trigger of past trauma is coupled with the potential for future trauma, people don't react the same way as each other. Take the Global Citizen Stampede, for example. The main focus of this video is the stampede, but look at all those people in the foreground, just watching. They're not panicking. After the stampede, I called Stephen Adelman. He's the vice president of a trade association called the Event Safety Alliance. His main point was that the answer to dealing with mass panic incidents, whether false alarms or real, lies in human psychology. He used a basic bell curve to illustrate his point. Here it is. In a potentially dangerous emergency, there are basically 3 types of people. About 10% of people will respond well. They'll quickly perceive the actual level of danger and then react accordingly and calmly. About another 10% will respond poorly. In Steve's words, they're the ones running around with their hair on fire. That 80% in the middle, they're what he calls sheep. They aren't quite sure what to do, so they look around and see what everyone else is doing. The key to emergency management, in one sense, is equipping the top 10% to become the shepherds instead of the running around with your hair on fire 10%. Because once a stampede is triggered, it's run or get trampled, even if you're not panicking yourself. We'll talk about how to do that in a minute, but the fact is, most people actually don't panic. Behavioral psychology research backs this up. A 2006 article in the Journal of Public Health Policy studied whether large-scale terror attacks actually created panic. And based on the title, you can probably guess what they found. They studied survivor reactions to 5 terror attacks. In the immediate response to these attacks, the researchers actually found that most people didn't panic. Many people inside the World Trade Center on 9/11, for example, gathered their belongings and secured filing cabinets before evacuating. And in the London Tube attack, some people did start panicking initially, the bottom 10% if you will, but others in the train car calmed them down, the shepherds. That's the biggest response, unity. The researchers found that in these potentially mass panic-inducing situations, people looked toward each other for cues on how to react, just like in Steve's bell curve. So, who are you? Are you securing the filing cabinets, or are you freaking out? Or do you just need to take a moment to look around, to recognize that you're a sheep in the 80% and find someone to follow? That's how to avoid a mass panic situation like Global Citizen. That brings us to our final point, resilience. I want to be clear here that recovering from trauma is a lifelong process, one that is painful and difficult and heavy. But that process is moving toward hope. Researchers studied traumatic events from history all over the world, and again found that while acknowledging the depth of pain and hurt and trauma that individuals underwent, the long-term response of the society was strength. People engaged in what researchers called useful coping, like volunteering and rebuilding, and putting new government structures or laws in place to avoid a similar trauma in the future. In some cases, especially for refugees, researchers also found lower levels of mental health problems in the longer term. When these people encountered new stressors, they were better equipped to handle them and process them in a healthy way because they'd been through it before. Trauma is real and painful, and when it is triggered in an incident like the Global Citizen Festival, there are real consequences, whether it's another emergency or a false alarm. Understanding that trauma without minimizing it is important. Develop a self-awareness about how you might react in such a situation. And if you find yourself in one, take a moment, just a moment, to think about your own tendencies if you find yourself starting to panic. But equally important is emphasizing the strength of human beings even after trauma. And that's probably more than you wanted to know.